So this is going to be our session 2 about the clinical outcomes in SYNGAP. Yeah, perfect. You guys are great. Very good. Who was the guy who shushed? I'll come back to you if I need to. So what I wanted to give you a little bit of food for thought, and I was allowed to have 2 slides. Mike allowed me to have a few more, but I'm going to be very, very brief. So some things to kind of consider that I just wanted you to kind of be aware of going into this meeting, and this might be food for this discussion, is that I'm not really an expert in SYNGAP, so we've really been doing SYNGAP only for the last 2 or 3 years. But what I'm already seeing is that SYNGAP is a disease like no other. Yeah, this is basically, I think it often helps when we just kind of use our analogies from the sodium channels or from other conditions, but just keep in mind SYNGAP is SYNGAP, and we need to ask the question, what is unique and what is shared? What I think is becoming more clear in SYNGAP than in many of the other genetic epilepsies is that SYNGAP is more than seizures. We have issues with behavior, sleep. We have kind of a good presentation on sleep, features in adult that Danielle is going to talk about, and many non-neurological features. And then kind of, I'm going to share one quick slide about some of the concepts when we think about lived experience. Yeah, that we actually have ways to kind of integrate some of the kind of patient-reported outcomes, not as some sort of like a soft, intangible features, but there's actually science behind it that we can tap into. And finally, it's 2022, almost 2023. Yeah. So the idea is we have new tools for clinical studies. So Kimberly's going to kick off talking about the data from the CIITIZEN database, and think of this almost like a new dimension, something that is new there. And while this may not be perfect, while this is just in the beginning stage, it can sometimes help us get to the answer faster. Here's just one example. So those are milestones in SYNGAP for rolling over, sitting, crawling, walking, grasping, based on 1,200 patient years and roughly 155 individuals. Yeah, it didn't take 10 years to generate this. This was a 3 months work using EMR data. So there's a way to kind of tap into resources, and some of these elements are actually quite useful. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip my next few slides about how SYNGAP is actually different and how the medication landscape is a little bit unusual. I'll come to this. So this is basically work that we've done in a different condition, STXBP1. This is a so-called disease concept model. So when we ask the question, what are the symptoms that caregivers experience, that patients have, that impact caregivers, there's actually a very formal process. It's called a disease concept model. And this is something that kind of really allows us to really define the entire lived experience and really define the outcome measures that we would eventually need. Yeah, and the idea is basically lived experience is tangible. We can measure this, and there's a very clear science behind this. Finally, please use the ICD code. So this is also the SYNGAP ICD code is too young to do something meaningful with, but here's an example from Dravet. So it's a poster that we have at AES, where we looked at, where we reconstructed Dravet histories from a little more than 700 patients using claims data. So this is health insurance data, and where we actually get some sense that actually using the ICD code reduces symptoms, or patients who have the ICD codes have a different kind of care than patients who don't have this. So we have a lower frequency of intellectual disability, behavioral issues. So those are some interesting ways how we can use this at a very large scale. So let me kick this off and hand this over to kind of Kimberly. Again, SYNGAP is like no other. Yeah, it's more than seizures, and it's 2022.
All right, thank you so much. That was an excellent introduction for what I will be talking about. My name is Kim Wiltrout. Thank you so much for that introduction. I was so excited to be with you in person. I'm actually in Nashville right now, but unfortunately came down with something after getting here. So thank you for bearing with me as I present this from my hotel room here in Nashville. And I will be talking about the SYNGAP1 clinical spectrum that we've gleaned from the CIITIZEN database. At this point, I have no disclosures. As I mentioned, over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll review what we've been able to collect in the background for SYNGAP1 from previous studies, and then describe some of the methods of data collection for CIITIZEN and the phenotypic data that we're able to get from that database. And then we'll move into some conclusions from the phenotypic data. So a reminder that the first descriptions of SYNGAP1 were actually as a non-syndromic and intellectual disability in 2009, so not that very long ago. And then soon after was described in relationship with autism spectrum disorder, and then in 2013 described with developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. As of 2019, it was reported that over 200 patients with SYNGAP1 related disorder were described in the literature, but we know that there are many others. And so as Ingo is referring to, we're really trying to efficiently get the phenotypic information out there, but also do so correctly. And the genotype of SYNGAP1 related disorders has been described as most individuals having de novo variants, meaning not inherited from parents, but we know that some parental gonadal mosaicism does occur as well. 60% of the variants are nonsense or frame shift, 30% are missense and splice, about 11% are microdeletions, and the rest are from chromosomal translocations, as has been described previously. Dr. Shepard, who was the moderator for the first session, has a paper from 2019 that very nicely describes the broad spectrum of symptoms that are associated with SYNGAP1 encephalopathy or SYNGAP1 related disorder, including intellectual disability, behavioral problems, autism spectrum disorder, different sensory problems such as a high pain threshold, sleeping problems, ataxia and gait abnormalities, as well as epilepsy. And the epilepsy has been described to affect over 85% of individuals, and it's primarily a generalized epilepsy, although a minority will have focal seizures. And the seizure onset has been described as being between 3 months to 7 years, with a median or an average about 2 years of age. And there are some very distinctive seizure types with SYNGAP1, such as the eyelid myoclonia or eyelid myoclonia that evolves to a myoclonic atonic seizure, so a little jerk and then a drop, or chewing-induced reflex seizures. And some genotype-phenotype correlations have also been described as milder phenotypes occurring more often in patients who have variants in the exons 1 through 4, compared to more severe phenotypes in exons, later exons 8 through 15. So with the SYNGAP study, we sought to utilize the data that's been collected by CIITIZEN, and I know many of you have likely heard about this and potentially have participated, but I'll just briefly describe what this database includes. Data from individuals with SYNGAP1 variants were collected from Invitae's CIITIZEN database, as I mentioned, and CIITIZEN is a patient-centric real-world data platform. They collect record sets and then extract that data using their own standard terminologies, and then provide that data to researchers. Oops, sorry. Some of the assumptions, though, that need to be made when you're utilizing data collected from the electronic medical record or other sort of medical record sources are that you have to utilize either ICD-10 codes or other information from the physician's notes. And so rather than hearing straight from the parents what the earliest age of diagnosis is, you have to approximate the age of onset or the time of diagnosis from what's been documented in the medical record. And similarly, then the last date of entry for is assumed to be a stop date for a certain symptom or medication. And you also have to assume that patients with a diagnosis code actually have fit the diagnostic criteria. And then also, if the symptom is not entered in the database, it's thought to be then not occurring. So all of these assumptions have to be made or thought about when utilizing this information from the medical record. And we sought to compare what we're able to glean from the CIITIZEN database with what has been described in the literature before in studies where parent interviews were utilized, or questionnaires, or direct physician review of the medical record. So in the citizen cohort that we collected with 150 data from 150 individuals, similar to what has been described before, there were 71% truncating variants, 17% missense or small in frame, 8% intronic, and 4% copy number variants. So again, similar to what has been described in the literature before. And the phenotypes in patients with SYNGAP1, either likely pathogenic or pathogenic variants in the citizen cohort, recapitulate what has been described similarly from the Vlaskamp et al. Paper that I had mentioned earlier. So epilepsy was seen in 80% of individuals. Global developmental delay was diagnosed in 95% and intellectual disability in 45%. Together, 100% of the individuals had either a global developmental delay or an intellectual disability diagnosis. Autistic features were seen in 68%, behavioral problems in 67%, ADHD in 6.7%. So that's actually lower or sort of on par with the ADHD that's diagnosed in the US in the general population. Sleep problems in 60%, and this could range from diagnoses of sleep apnea or insomnia or restless legs in sleep. Feeding problems were diagnosed in 47% of individuals, sensory problems in 16.7%. And in this, I included the high pain threshold that was described in the Vlaskamp et al. Paper. And then a newer diagnosis that sort of came out of the citizen cohort was that 22% of individuals were diagnosed with anxiety disorders as well that hadn't been described before. And I will also say here that when we looked at the percent of those with these diagnoses in truncating or missense, intronic, or copy number variants and tried to compare across the different genotypes, there were no significant differences between the genotypes. And then looking at movement disorders, which have been described before in those with SYNGAP1, ataxia or an abnormal gait was diagnosed in 52% if you put the two together, which is again on par with what has been described before. Also coming out of this data set are diagnoses of tremor, tics, and some diagnoses of cerebral palsy. And then from this data set, you can also get a sense of the timing or the onset of these conditions or the timing of when the diagnoses are made, and sort of get a story of what occurs in those with SYNGAP1 related disorder. So first, there is a diagnosis made of global developmental delay in the infancy period with a median sort of between 1 and 2 years. This is followed then by a diagnosis of epilepsy with that median around 2 years. And then ataxia overlaps that a little bit, followed by autistic features or autism diagnoses, and then intellectual disability, which makes sense based on the sort of timing of when these evaluations are often undertaken, with autism often having an evaluation around the sort of 2-3 year mark, and then intellectual disability around the 5-year mark. Oops, sorry. And then we can also look at the time.
Kim, just one second. We have a little bit of a, I think, problem. Kim?
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I think we have a little bit of a, okay, I think we have a delay and we have a slight connection problem. Maybe just kind of, there are some kind of times when the audio just kind of jumps.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, Kim, turn your video off. That's a good idea.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, let's see if that helps. Am I sounding clear? I can't hear you now.
No, you can only hear me, but you sound good now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for all these technical difficulties. So then looking at seizure-free probability and the time to seizure onset from the CITIZEN cohort, we can see that, again, there is a sort of 50% of those diagnosed with epilepsy or having seizures occur at around that 2-year mark. But it does, in those who aren't at that point, there does continue to be seizure onset even after that and into the childhood years. And the descriptions of the epilepsy phenotype in the SYNGAP1 cohort within CITIZEN are also in keeping with what has been described before. Here I share from a smaller, earlier cohort from the CITIZEN data, but we see primarily absence or atypical absence seizures, then followed by atonic seizures and eyelid myoclonia. This, I also wanted to bring up with this table, though, that what I didn't include in the table is that very frequently what is included in the data set are just the word seizure, not classified in any way. And so this functions as a reminder to us as clinicians to be descriptive in the EMR if we're hoping to glean from it these more detailed descriptions of the epilepsy phenotype. And then lastly, a number of recurrent variants were identified in the CITIZEN cohort. And a couple things are interesting about these recurrent variants. First of all, the seizure types and age of epilepsy onset was really variable, even among those who had the same variant, and which adds to our knowledge of the genotype-phenotype relationships. But what we also noticed is that for some of the variants, particularly the recurrent C333 deletion of the A here in exon 4, all of the individuals with this variant were able to utilize verbal communication and speak in phrases compared to those with other variants in which there was variability among individuals for their verbal ability, or all of the individuals were nonverbal with those variants. So we did, in that sense, see a sort of milder language delay in those with variants in exon 4, specifically this variant that I highlight here. And so to conclude, we were able to recapitulate the phenotypic findings from prior studies using this new methodology in a larger population of individuals with SYNGAP1 related disorder. And as Ingo had mentioned, we were able to do it much quicker. The phenotypes of patients with truncating, missense, in-frame, splice site microdeletions were overall similar. And we were able to identify some recurrent variants, which provided additional genotype-phenotype relationship information. Some references. And then I also wanted to mention that we have been working on a medical care considerations packet for SYNGAP1 related disorder. And we do have a printout of it. This is just an example of the table from the medical care considerations. We would love to have you look at it and provide your feedback before the final is printed and distributed. And the targeted audience for this is general pediatricians in the community, families wanting some more information. And then finally, I just want to say thank you to my mentor, Dr. Paduri, and the team at the Boston Children's Hospital Epilepsy Genetics Clinic. And then also a thank you to Ellie Brimble from the Invitae Citizen database. And then finally to the SYNGAP Research Fund for their support of this project. And thank you to the patients and the families who participated and provided their data to this Citizen database. Thank you.
Perfect, Kim. Thank you so much. Kim, feel free to turn your video back on. And I think since our talks are a little bit different in terms of topic, I think we could maybe squeeze in 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
And if you guys ask questions, I'll repeat them for Kim because you probably can't hear us. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have looked at the overlap between any of the symptoms. So for instance, do you see anxiety and behavior overlap or behavior and autism overlap in the same patients, or are they in different patients? I mean, if they're both in 2/3 of the patients, then there's going to be some overlap, but is it a tight overlap or not?
I would say I haven't looked at all the possibilities for overlap, but there is somewhat of an overlap between behavior and autism, but that's a good suggestion to look more into the different overlap.
Yeah, I'd say anxiety too, and probably even more than that. But thank you for your interest in this project. It's really important to us parents.
Thank you for participating.
Any other questions?
Hey, Kim, it's Mike Ralia
Hi.
over here, Ingo.
Oh, President, sorry, Mike.
So, Kim, it's amazing that you were able to validate the hard work of Dr. Sheffer with the classic natural history study with what you've done here, or validate CITIZEN, depending on which way you want to flow. But pay my respects. But two questions. One, I think one of the things that families struggle with mightily is meds. We are all on too many meds. We are all switching meds. We are all comparing notes on meds. We all have different responses to meds. We are all sick and tired of meds. What you've shared is what you've been able to analyze so far, but there's also a lot of important med information in here. So can you give us a teaser of what we might be able to learn about what meds haven't worked, and then a little based on what you've seen, would you encourage the handful of families who might be watching this recording, because of course every family in this room signed up for CITIZEN, would you encourage them to sign up for CITIZEN based on how easy and cheap it is for them? It's free. And how much data we get for clinicians like yourself? That's a loaded question, but please get it right.
And Kim, I can add to this too, because we kind of had a look at this data too. Yeah.
Sure. So I
perfect. Okay.
oh, sorry. I think
We have a slight audio delay, so just keep on talking and ignore what I'm saying. Yeah.
oh, okay. Yes. So I did not include the medication information in this talk due to time, but have been looking at the medications, and it does seem that there are from the data set, there are some medications that are continued more than others. It's from the data set, you can't always glean from that whether it's continued due to efficacy likely, or if there are side effect issues, that some of the side effects are included in the data set, but there do seem to be some medications that are continued more than others, and more on this to come. And I think Ingo, I think you had some graphs that you had to share.
And without kind of talking too much about this, but we've actually analyzed this. So there seems to be a superiority for Depakote and Lamictal in the data set, as we would expect. Yeah. And this is what I think is quite interesting about the medication, is that it seems to be a bit more kind of constant than we would see this in some of the other conditions. So when we look at our sodium channels, there's lots of changes there. Syngap, people don't change medication as often. And Syngap has its own specific medication profile. We can use EMR data to kind of look at comparative effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, and then there's one more question.
The CITIZEN question, Kim. Would you encourage parents to do?
Also, yeah,
to participate.
Mike was asking the question where you kind of whether you would encourage families to join up for CITIZEN or not.
I think if interested in becoming involved in research, that CITIZEN is an opportunity to do so, and we are thankful and utilize the data that they provide, that they have.
Thank you. From the data set, I'm wondering if you can glean the median age when these patients acquire genetic diagnosis, as this pertains to how we approach treatment development.
Yes. So the average age from the data set was 6 years, actually, with quite a range between 1 up until adulthood. And so you're right, that does certainly have implications for treatment, particularly because we see that there is a period of identification of global developmental delay, or perhaps some autistic features, before seeing seizures and epilepsy. And so if you're waiting until epilepsy occurs, now testing sort of after the fact and at the 2, 3, 4 year age.
So with regards to how you guys use the citizen data, so it's all coming into y'all. Is there a way, so I've seen talks now with SYNGAP. I've seen your talk with STXB1, and I'm wondering if there is a way to automate how you use this information and how you come up with these graphs. In other words, I've heard you talk of this automate, this atom bits of data that you're using and everything. And so I'm always thinking about, but there's a lot of DEEs and we're all signing up for Citizen. So how do we get the way that you guys have analyzed this data, and how do we abstract that and automate the process somewhat with the caveat that I know that it has to be interpreted. So you can't really ever bypass that, but it seems like that a lot of this could be automated. Thoughts on that?
So Kim, I'm actually okay to take this question offline because I think this is more for me than for you. Yeah. But do you have any thoughts about how you could kind of scale this or automate this?
Go ahead.
Guys, we'll take this offline because it's kind of yeah. Any other questions for Kim? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned some recurrent variants, and I was just wondering how many and what. I'd like to hear more about that, especially since they show different phenotypes.
Yes, and so I did have numbers. They didn't show up on the PowerPoint, and I'm showing this at a poster I'm sharing actually later this week at AES if you are there. But let me bring it up. So for the different recurrent variants, there were. And this is easier if I'm showing you from the PowerPoint, but there were 8 different variants that showed recurrence, anywhere from 2 individuals having them up to 5 individuals having them.
I think we'll do one last question.
Thanks. Could you speak a little bit more about exon location and phenotype? I know you had a slide on it, but where that correlation might lie?
Yes. So when looking at the phenotype, comparing the exon location, we did not find a difference in the phenotype with the exon locations, except for a possible decrease in the frequency of ataxia diagnosis in those in exons 9 to 13. I didn't show the diagram for that, but we're looking into that more. But then for the recurrent variants, the variant that I highlighted in exon 4 seemed to have a milder language delay compared to the other recurrent variants, compared to the other variants. And it has been described before in other papers that perhaps the intellectual disability is milder in those with variants in exon 4.
So Kim, thank you so much.